It was a slow Tuesday afternoon when Officer Reynolds drove his cruiser through Lincoln Park, the sun hanging low and the heat lazy on the sidewalks. Most of his shifts were quiet these days, checking parking meters, waving at joggers, making sure teenagers weren't being too loud. It wasn't that he disliked his job, he just didn't see much purpose in it anymore. That's when he spotted him. A kid, maybe 16 or 17, sitting alone at a picnic table with a thick textbook in his lap and a notebook full of scribbles. He was wearing a hoodie despite the heat, earphones in, head bent low, completely absorbed in what looked like physics. Reynolds slowed the car and rolled down the window, raising an eyebrow. "That's new," he muttered. He pulled up alongside the curb, leaned halfway out of the window, and said with a smirk, "That's some light reading for the park, huh?" The boy looked up, puzzled, removing one earbud. "Sorry? Didn't realize Einstein took naps here," Reynolds chuckled, half joking, half suspicious. "What's that, rocket science?" "Quantum thermodynamics," the teen replied plainly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Reynolds blinked. "You serious?" The boy just nodded and turned back to his notebook, as if the conversation didn't warrant further energy. The officer lingered, unsure why he felt irritated. "Well, don't cause any trouble," he said finally, then added under his breath, "Never thought I'd see a hoodie and physics textbook in the same sentence." He drove off slowly, watching the kid in the mirror, waiting for him to pull out a speaker or meet up with some friends for mischief. But the teen never moved. Just kept writing. Reynolds didn't know his name. Didn't care to ask. To him, it was just another weird moment in an otherwise boring day. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't know, was that he hadn't interrupted a teenager wasting time. He had interrupted the next speaker on the TED stage. A mind sharper than most adults he knew. And a voice the world was about to hear. He wouldn't understand that until it was too late. Malik had learned early that quiet places were hard to come by. At home, the apartment walls were thin, the television was always on in the next room, and someone was always moving, cooking, shouting, living. It wasn't chaos, just life packed into a tight space. But for Malik, whose mind constantly danced with questions about atoms, time, light, and the edges of reality, that kind of noise felt like a cage. So he found his silence elsewhere. The park became his refuge, not for friends or games, but for thinking. Every day after school, and every Saturday morning before the neighborhood even stirred, he would walk down with a backpack heavier than most, filled not with snacks or sports gear, but textbooks far above his grade level. His current favorite was Introduction to Quantum Thermodynamics, a title he had to explain more than once, usually to people who didn't wait long enough to hear the answer. Malik wasn't a prodigy in the way TV liked to show. He wasn't solving equations at 5 or inventing machines at 8, but he was deeply curious. And more than that, he was disciplined. His teachers noticed early on that he asked unusual questions, questions that didn't fit neatly into the curriculum. While most kids his age complained about exams, Malik stayed after class to ask about uncertainty principles and particle duality. But not every teacher appreciated that. Some saw him as disruptive. Some, as trying too hard. Others, with a patronizing smile, told him to just stick to the assignment. And so, he learned to keep his questions to himself. At home, his mother worked 2 jobs and came home too tired to hear about thermodynamic entropy. His older brother teased him gently but often, "Yo, NASA, take a break. You gonna levitate the fridge next?" Only his grandmother took his curiosity seriously. She'd sit in her old recliner and listen with a soft smile as he tried to explain things even he didn't fully grasp yet. "If you can teach it," she'd say, "you already halfway understand it." When she passed, Malik found it harder to share what excited him. He began to write instead, filling notebooks with questions, diagrams, and half-thoughts. The world inside his mind was vivid and vast, and physics gave it shape. Laws, patterns, beauty and equations. It wasn't just science to him. It was a way to make sense of everything. But despite his brilliance, Malik knew how people saw him. A lanky black teen in a hoodie. Too quiet. Too intense. Teachers sometimes assumed he was disengaged. Strangers in the park gave him side eyes. Security guards followed him in stores. None of it was new. He'd learned to swallow it, to keep his head down and focus. But sometimes, when a stranger made a comment, like that officer had, it still hit somewhere deep. As if the world was trying to remind him of its expectations. Still, he kept showing up to that same picnic table. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove to himself that none of them defined him. He didn't want attention. He wanted understanding. And somewhere, deep down, he hoped that one day, someone might actually listen to what he had to say, not in spite of who he was, but because of it. The envelope looked out of place the moment Malik pulled it from the pile of school mail, thicker paper, embossed edges, and a crimson logo in the corner that read TED Youth Global Initiative. At first, he thought it was a mistake. It had to be. He hadn't told anyone about the paper he submitted months ago, just hours before the deadline. He didn't think anyone would even read it, let alone respond. Hands slightly trembling, he opened it carefully, as if the weight of its words might spill out too quickly. The letter began, "We were deeply impressed by your essay submitted to the Regional Young Scholars Forum. On behalf of our review committee, we are honored to invite you to speak at this year's TED Youth Global Conference. Your voice and ideas reflect the exact kind of brilliance we hope to spotlight." The words blurred. Malik stared at the letter, then folded it and slipped it into the back of his notebook like it was something fragile he couldn't afford to expose. All day, the invitation burned a hole in his thoughts. He should have felt proud. But all he felt was doubt. Speak on a stage? About physics? In front of strangers? He pictured a theater with spotlights and suits, polished kids from elite schools, confident voices molded by years of debate clubs and private tutors. What would they hear when he opened his mouth? His thoughts were haunted by echoes, his principal saying he might not be leadership material, the police officer smirking at his notebook, classmates mocking the way he pronounced photoelectric. Even his own reflection in the mirror sometimes looked unsure. That night, Malik sat at his small kitchen table and opened a blank page. "Thank you for the invitation," he wrote. "But unfortunately, I must decline." He stared at the sentence. For a long time, he couldn't finish it. Something wouldn't let him. The next day, he approached Mr. Hale, his physics teacher, and quietly handed him the letter. Mr. Hale read it once, then twice, then looked up at Malik with a kind of stunned joy. "You are going," he said plainly. Malik shook his head slightly. "I don't know if I belong there." Mr. Hale leaned forward. "You don't just belong there, Malik. That stage is lucky to have you. You explain the universe like it's poetry. You make science human. People need that. They need you." And in that moment, Malik realized something. TED hadn't invited him out of pity or charity. They didn't see the hoodie. They didn't hear the accent. They had read the ideas. The clarity. The quiet fire. And they had chosen him. Not because he fit. But because he didn't. When Malik stepped into the lobby of the conference center, it was like stepping into another world, glass walls that stretched up into the sky, polished floors so reflective he could see the soles of his sneakers, and a sea of people who looked like they belonged in magazines or college brochures. The other students moved with the kind of ease that comes from knowing you've been invited your whole life. They wore blazers and crisp dresses, carried tablets, greeted one another with confident laughs and names that echoed across private academies. Malik kept his backpack close and his hoodie up, suddenly hyper-aware of the way his voice might sound if he spoke, of how tightly he was holding his folder of notes, of the one pair of dress shoes his mother had borrowed money to buy for him just 2 days earlier. The check-in volunteer gave him a polite smile but did a double-take when she read his name tag, like she was surprised he was actually on the list. "Oh. You're one of the speakers," she said, and he nodded. "Great. Speaker lounge is to the left. Have a good morning." Her voice was kind, but the pause between her sentences stuck with him. As he walked toward the lounge, he passed a group of students discussing stage energy and body control, terms he had only ever heard on YouTube videos. One girl said she had been practicing with a public speaking coach for 6 months. Another boy mentioned how his prep school had flown in a mentor from Stanford. Malik sat down in the corner of the lounge and opened his notebook, pretending to review, but mostly just trying to breathe. He felt like a ghost, like no one saw him unless he moved too suddenly. One of the other speakers, an older teen with perfect posture and designer glasses, glanced at Malik's hoodie, then away, uninterested. For a moment, Malik wondered if the letter had been a mistake after all. But then, almost by accident, he overheard 2 event coordinators whispering near the door. "Did you read that thermodynamics essay from the kid from Chicago?" One of them said. "The way he explained entropy with emotion? I've never seen anything like it." Malik froze. They didn't see him hearing, but those words landed like anchors. They weren't talking about a name, or an outfit, or a voice, they were talking about what he had said. Slowly, something inside him began to settle. He wasn't here to fit. He was here to speak. The lights were hotter than he expected, casting a blinding halo across the edge of the stage as Malik stepped forward, clutching the wireless microphone in his right hand like it might break if he held it too tight or vanish if he let go. From behind the curtain, everything had seemed distant, like a show he wasn't part of, just watching, but now, facing the sea of faces, he felt every beat of his heart in his ears. A hush fell over the crowd, the way audiences go quiet when they're curious but unsure. He could sense the weight of their expectations, or worse, their doubts. For a split second, he wanted to turn around and walk back behind the curtain, to disappear into the wings, to let someone else with the right voice, the right posture, the right everything take his place. But then, his fingers brushed against the edge of his notebook in his pocket, the one filled with years of scribbled questions, formulas, metaphors, and dreams. He took one deep breath. And began. His voice trembled on the first sentence, but he didn't stop. He talked about heat and order, about entropy not just as a physical principle but as a metaphor for the human condition, how systems fall apart, how energy scatters, how we try to bring meaning to the chaos. He used the example of a crowded apartment with 6 people and 1 working fan, and the audience laughed. Not mockingly, but warmly. He quoted Sadi Carnot, then followed it with a story about losing his grandmother and how grief, too, felt like energy diffusing across time. And as he spoke, something shifted. The tremble in his voice vanished. The room leaned in. His hoodie, his accent, the quiet way he looked at the floor between paragraphs, none of it mattered. His ideas, his presence, his truth took center stage. And when he finally stopped, after 11 minutes and 24 seconds, there was a full second of silence, deep, reverent, before the room erupted. Not polite applause. A standing ovation. Malik stood frozen for a moment, then allowed himself to smile, not because they clapped, but because he knew he hadn't changed himself to be here. He had brought all of who he was to that stage. And that had been enough. Officer Reynolds sat in his recliner, half watching the local news segment as he scrolled through his phone, the evening winding down in its usual quiet way. The reporter's voice droned on about city council meetings and school renovations, background noise to a tired mind. He didn't look up until he heard the words "local teen delivers viral TED Talk" and from the south side of Chicago. He blinked, looked toward the screen, just in time to catch a flash of a familiar face. The camera cut to a wide shot of a TED stage, and standing in the center was the boy, that boy, from the park. The one with the textbook and the hoodie. For a second, Reynolds thought maybe he was mistaken, but then the angle shifted, and the voice that filled the room matched the one that had once replied to him with quiet confidence: quantum thermodynamics. The officer sat forward slowly, lowering his phone. The screen now showed the teen mid-sentence, describing the movement of heat as a metaphor for loss, for systems unraveling, for the fragile beauty of structure in a world destined toward disorder. Reynolds couldn't understand all of the science, but something in the way the boy spoke kept him watching, the clarity, the rhythm, the weight of the words. The audience on screen was transfixed. The officer remembered how he had laughed that day, not cruelly, but carelessly, how he'd leaned out of his car window with that smirk and said something dismissive, just a throwaway comment, the kind adults often make to teenagers they don't expect much from. He hadn't thought twice about it. Until now. He thought of the boy's reaction, calm, polite, then quietly returning to his notebook. He thought of how he had driven away, assuming the moment didn't matter. But now, watching that same kid command a global stage, Reynolds felt a slow shame settle into his chest. Not because he had been harsh, but because he had been blind. He hadn't seen the brilliance sitting on that park bench. He had seen a hoodie. A teenager. A stereotype. The segment ended with the anchor calling the teen one of the brightest scientific voices of his generation. Reynolds stared at the blank screen long after the broadcast moved on, the reflection of the television faint in his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a man doing his job. He felt like someone who had missed something important, something he could never undo. But he also felt something else, hope. That maybe the world was finally learning to listen to the voices it once ignored. Even if it had taken far too long. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Malik returned to the park, the same one where it had all started, though everything now felt slightly different, as if the trees stood taller, the light fell softer, or maybe it was just him who had changed. The city was waking up slowly, the streets still drowsy with dew, and the same cracked pavement curved around the grass, leading him past the playground, past the rusted swing set, to the old wooden bench beneath the sycamore tree. It looked exactly as it had before, faded, splintered at the edge, slightly tilted. But this time, when Malik sat down and opened his notebook, there was no weight on his shoulders. No second-guessing glances over his back. No quiet urge to shrink himself. Just breath, and space, and memory. He ran his fingers along the spine of the notebook, the same one he'd written in that day when the officer laughed, when his ideas were just private treasures, too heavy to carry, too delicate to share. So much had changed since then. The TED Talk had gone viral, passed between classrooms, reposted by physicists, artists, students, people he'd never meet but who wrote to him with words like "Thank you and I saw myself in your story." A university had offered him mentorship. A nonprofit had asked him to speak to underserved youth about science. His mother had cried when she saw the standing ovation. And Malik, still the same quiet soul in a hoodie, still more comfortable with equations than applause, had learned to hold his head a little higher. Not out of arrogance, but understanding. Understanding that brilliance, when it comes wrapped in skin the world isn't used to celebrating, must be protected, nurtured, not dimmed. As he scribbled a new thought about particle coherence and loss, he heard footsteps. A man walked by in a patrol uniform, Officer Reynolds. He slowed, recognition flickering across his face. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. The officer gave a small, almost uncertain nod. Malik nodded back. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. There was no apology, no dramatic speech. Just a passing acknowledgement, like two people who had once stood on opposite sides of the same moment but now understood it differently. When the man was gone, Malik looked back down at his notes. The wind stirred the edges of the pages, and somewhere, not far away, a child's laughter echoed. The bench creaked beneath him. The world had not become perfect. Racism hadn't vanished. Not every door would be open. But Malik no longer sat there wondering if he had the right to speak. He knew now that his voice mattered. That his ideas had shape. That the universe, vast and strange as it was, had always made room for minds like his. And as he lifted his pen again, his thoughts no longer felt like whispers. They felt like declarations. Not of arrival, but of beginning.